So hello and welcome everyone. I'm Rebecca Chan, Program Officer for the National Creative Placemaking Program at Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC. We are thrilled today to present the third webinar in our How to Do Creative Placemaking series. And this time around we'll be focused on the topic of crafting an evaluation plan and measuring impact for a creative placemaking program or project. Before we get going, I want to acknowledge some of the people that have made today's webinar possible. First, I want to acknowledge the LISC Institute. Amani Darden from the Institute is on the webinar today behind the scenes. And I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Director of the National Creative Placemaking Program at LISC, Lynn McCormick. I want to thank the National Endowment for the Arts for supporting this project, in particular Jen Hughes, Director of the NEA's Design Division, and Catherine Bray-Simons, Design Specialist, who manages the Our Town Grant Program. I also want to thank our other supporters of this series, the Kresge Foundation. This initiative is part of a larger project that the Kresge Foundation and the NEA have supported for the past 2 years. And along those same lines, I also want to thank PolicyLink, who is our partner in the initiative, providing invaluable research and evaluation expertise along the way. So a few quick housekeeping things. By now, you have hopefully either connected to your computer's audio or dialed in through the separate phone number which is available in your registration email. Due to the number of participants that have signed on, we will have everyone muted throughout the presentation. We will be collecting questions as we go, as well as at the end of the webinar. You can type questions into the chat box or Q&A box, both of which are found on the bottom right side of your screen. And when you ask questions, please address questions to specific panelists so we can direct them accordingly. We have a lot of material to cover in the next hour, and we are going to follow a similar format to the past two How to Do Creative Placemaking webinars. We'll do a more theoretical introduction to the material to start things off, and then we'll hear from a practitioner as to how this work actually played out in the field. And then we'll have a brief reflection and discussion period, followed by a Q&A. So this brings me to today's speakers. I am delighted to introduce Lynn Osgood. Lynn Osgood is an urban planner and researcher and the founder and director of Go Collaborative. Lynn trained in landscape architecture and planning at the University of Virginia, and in 2003 relocated to Austin, Texas, where she became adjunct faculty at the University of Texas. In 2011, she founded Go Collaborative and now leads the development of creative placemaking projects such as the NEA Exploring Our Town website and the ArtPlace America-funded Drawing Lines project. And following Lynn, we'll hear from Eileen Allen. Eileen recently took on the role of Program Manager for Venture Cafe Miami, which seeks to grow and enhance Miami's innovation community by making it more diverse, inclusive, and accessible. In addition, Eileen works as a consultant around cultural arts, creative placemaking, and organizational growth. Previously, she spent 7 years leading the integration of arts and culture into neighborhood revitalization strategies for the Opelika Community Development Corporation, and we're going to be hearing more about that very shortly. Thank you both for joining us. So I'd like to start the conversation by delivering a bit of context on evaluation and measuring impact from our colleagues at the NEA, who unfortunately are unable to join us today. Jen Hughes, Director of the Design Program, writes, "The National Endowment for the Arts acknowledges that measuring impact in creative placemaking can be a long-term endeavor, and that the work of creative placemaking is often not linear. Ultimately, the NEA Our Town program strives to strengthen communities by integrating arts and culture into community development work, offering a new approach to addressing a range of challenges that rural, urban, suburban, or tribal communities face. Our Town is intended to catalyze local, social, economic, or physical change in communities with the ultimate goal of driving systems change, enabling the long-term integration of arts and culture into community development. Local change might include physical improvements to public space, increase in local business revenues, or improvements to social relationships, while systems change might include new or novel partnerships between the arts and non-art sectors, civic and institutional leadership to further creative placemaking work, replication or scaling of innovative projects, long-term funding, training programs, or permanent staff positions. Some of these impacts might be measurable over the short term, but many set the stage of longer-term impact beyond the 2-year life of an Our Town project. The NEA is currently developing and testing a program evaluation framework for the Our Town program with the ultimate goal of surveying all 500+ Our Town grantees during the summer of 2019. The NEA plans to share more about this framework in early 2020, so stay tuned for that. So thank you for that message, Jen. And now I'm going to pass this off to Lynn Osgood, who is going to continue to explore this topic with us. Take it away, Lynn.
for being here. Oh, okay. Are we off mute now?
Yep.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I love talking about evaluation in the context of arts and community development, because I think in particular because artists and culture bearers, they bring such a sense, already have a native sense about what evaluation is, and the curiosity and the sense of exploration that they bring, their ability to create connections, and a larger sense of communal meaning that is so important to these projects. So my overall goal for today is to basically help folks not be afraid of evaluation. I think evaluation can often feel very heavy and onerous and like a very big load to carry. But in fact, what folks are often doing in their projects, particularly in terms of community engagement, are very much the same techniques that one uses in evaluation. What needs to happen is just a reframing a bit of gathering the data in a slightly different way, and then using that same information, again, in a different way that's going to create a larger narrative, a larger story that can be communicated out. So the first thing that I wanted to do was to talk about why evaluation is important, particularly in the context of arts-based community development and creative placemaking. And I think there are a number of things that are very specific to our field here. One is at the level of projects, that our projects are often bringing innovative ideas, innovative experiences, and we need to understand and be able to improve those projects in real time. And evaluation can help do that. Certain types of evaluation can help do that. Evaluation can also help with connections to communities and bringing in partners, because community members don't just have to be the focus of the evaluation. They can actually be on the other side with you, helping to do the evaluation. And I think one thing that's very critical to recognize in the field of creative placemaking is that we are all collectively building the ship as we're sailing it. This is a new field, and we are developing not only our understandings within each project, but our larger collective understanding. And so it's very important that we be able to share our stories with each other of what's going on and why things are working or not working. So the first thing to do is in embarking on this journey is to make sure that we set expectations not only for others but for ourselves. And it's very important to keep evaluation practices as very real, very grounded, and very much to take away the burden of having to prove anything. This is not a high school experiment where we have controls and we're working with theorems and creating proofs. This is actually, we're really just looking for correlations. As Rebecca was saying with the piece from Jen at the NEA, it is recognized that the way that arts impact community development is very often a long-term equation. And though we might see short-term impacts, we need to be gentle with ourselves in how it is that we are understanding and framing what it is that we are exploring. So if that's the why, I also want to give just a brief introduction, and we'll talk about this more in a bit, about the how. How is it that you think about evaluation? And it's very much like project management. The most essential thing, and I think of this as sort of framing the door by which you enter, is to start with an essential question. And this is important because, again, creative placemaking projects are complex, and what you are understanding will change as the nature of the project happen and evolve. But it's very important to have a clear sense when you first start. Now, in research, we talk about it as identifying a unit of analysis. And so that means, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is being very careful to identify what scale of impact are we trying to understand. Is it impacts for the individual, for the community, or for the much larger systems that we're all a part of? All are valid, but we need to choose one to enter in with. And because these projects are complex, we will touch on the other things. Then the next step is identifying what you already know. And this is where we can acknowledge that so much of basic project management, community engagement, things such as network mapping or asset mapping, things that were discussed in the last webinar, are very much the same things you would use in evaluation. What needs to happen if you are entering into it as evaluation is that you are just very careful that you, as the information comes forward and you receive it, you have a way of capturing it that you can use in the long term. Once you see what you have, then you can determine what you need to know. And you can also then bring in community partners to work collaboratively. Community members can come in at any time. They can help you. They can not only be the focus of what it is that you're looking at, but they can help you actually gather the information and sort it and create meaning with it. And then make sure also that you're creating space for this to happen. I think so often evaluation can be an add-on. So we want to really acknowledge that these are moments of creating understanding, and we can create events around them, where one term that's been used is the idea of data jams, where we gather people together and have the community members help us sort the information we have. And I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. And then most importantly, as you're creating this plan, that you think of, as you synthesize your findings, you're really thinking of the larger story and narrative that you're creating. This does not happen in a vacuum. Again, we're not creating these abstract constructs of knowledge. We're telling stories to ourselves, to each other, to our funders, to our community, to our elected officials. And so having an idea of who that audience or audiences are at the beginning can help us as we start to frame what it is that we'll be evaluating and how we'll be doing it. Now, so if those are the basic whys and how, it's important to talk about terms as well. There are a lot of terms in evaluation, a lot of confusing terms, a lot of terms that mean different things to different people, basic terms like outputs and outcomes and indicators and theory of change and logic models. The two that I want to focus on today specifically are theory of change and outcomes, because those are the ones that we use most essentially, particularly in the context of creative placemaking. So what I want to do is take the opportunity to present what the NEA is developing as their theory of change. Now, a theory of change, if we look, you sort of take a broad view of it and say, well, what is a theory of change? It's basically a description, an illustration, often a diagram, of how certain changes can be expected to happen, and specifically within a specific set of circumstances, a specific context. I think of them as a theory of change are like the structures that help us to hold and define the stories of change that we tell. And so the NEA, looking at all the R-Town projects that they were doing, did see patterns and wanted to identify how is it that the arts are actually, when they work in conjunction and in partnership with health, housing, public safety, and other fields, that they are actually, they know that they are creating results. They are creating equitable changes in the dimensions of economic, social, and physical systems in our world. And so working with 2M Research and Metris Arts Consulting, they started to identify what these outcomes were, and then also, as part of the theory of change, started to look at how is it that the arts were creating these changes, and why do we want to advocate for arts being at the table? And what they saw is that there are some essential functions that art takes within the context of creative placemaking, that in these projects the arts have the ability to illuminate and bring attention to new ideas and assets and voices, that the arts can energize and bring in additional resources and activities and enthusiasm to a project. And arts, like nothing else, have the capacity to help us to imagine and to think of new futures, and also to connect. I think something we need dearly in our world today, and the arts and culture can do it so beautifully to connect communities and people and places and build those relationships. So then how do you bring it all together in a theory of change? So here, the developing theory of change really, again, is a diagram. It's a model. And in this model, it says that there are things that happen, there are assets at the local community level, there are inputs, there's leadership, there's partnerships, there's resources, there's community buy-in. Those interact with these tactics and these these modes of working that art has within the communities. Together, these create the local changes. These are the outcomes, the impacts that happen on a very specific level for each project. But as you add them all up, you start seeing these larger level national changes. So that's an example of a theory of change and that happens at a diagram. So like the term theory of change, another good term to wrap our heads around is the term outcomes. Now, when we think of outcomes, outcomes are basically impacts and benefits and changes that you want to see happening as a result of the project. The NEA identified these at a systems level, and these changes were economic and social and physical. When we think of outcomes, what we want to think of is the things that are enhanced, increased, that are more of or new or altered. So these may be an increased number of jobs or a larger sense of identity within the neighborhood. Maybe there's a new feeling of agency among participants, or you see more activity along the streets. For all of these, a very good rule of thumb and a sort of good device to think of outcomes is they call them SMART outcomes. They're specific, they're measurable, they're attainable, they're realistic, they're grounded. They're relevant to ourselves as people coordinating projects, and to the community at large. And importantly, they're time-bound, meaning that they acknowledge that in their specificity that they are a short-term outcome or a long-term outcome or maybe somewhere in the middle. Then along with that, so in thinking of outcomes, so if that's a basic framework of what outcomes are, the next thing as we expand our thinking about outcomes is to think about outcomes in terms of different scales. Because I think this is one place where I think folks just feel completely overwhelmed. They know changes are happening all around them, but what are they and how to identify them? A very good way to start identifying outcomes is in terms of the different scales at which they happen. Now, in the NEA example, they were thinking very broadly at these very large system-level changes, the systems of environment, the physical system, social systems. But we can also think about outcomes, particularly in neighborhood projects, at the individual or group level. And these may be changes in awareness or opinions or behavior or skills. Maybe the impacts are happening more at a community level, in which case we see changes in conversations and discourse and social actions, maybe in policies and procedures. Or again, at a systems level like the NEA, of looking very broadly at how these impacts are cumulatively being created. So that's the why we do evaluation, and some basic hows and some terms of reference, the theory of change and the outcomes. And that's the basic doorway in which we enter. So now I want to introduce, so what do we do when we're on the other side of the door? Well, the good news is that there are lots and lots of ways to do evaluation. I think there's this idea that there's just sort of quote unquote evaluation, and then you take this object and you insert it at a certain, at any point in the project, and if you insert it at the end, well, you just have to do it more quickly, but the techniques will be the same and it'll all happen. But that's not the case. When you do evaluation determines how you do evaluation. And so what I want to introduce is 3 different types of evaluation that recognize this phenomena that when you do it will influence how you do it. And so there's 3 different types of evaluation. There's summative, formative, and developmental. So I'll introduce these one by one. They happen at the end, at the middle, and at the beginning of the project. So a summative evaluation happens at the end of a project. So this is the kind of project you've gone through it, you've done it, it's done. You've probably done this type of project before, and you know what's going to happen, and now you really want to capture what is it that exactly that happened, and how is it that we can bring understanding to this? At this point, you can create a very definitive theory of change, and you can also make decisions. Should we do this project again or not? Or should we make radical changes to it? In this type of evaluation, you'll probably be looking at much more quantitative information. You'll be using tools such as structured interviews and focus groups, polls and surveys, maybe looking at digital media trends. Now, in the next type of evaluation, formative evaluation, this is a type of evaluation you can do when you're midway through. So you haven't reached the end, but you've got your sea legs and you know sort of what's happening. But you're looking to bring a little bit deeper understanding to things. Now, in this sort of midstream evaluation, you'll probably be bringing in more qualitative information, and you might be looking at group conversations. You might be doing observations yourself, or using those same community engagement techniques like asset mapping and network mapping. And this is a stage where you can really start sketching out that theory of change. You're beginning to see the pattern. You may not be able to finalize it, but you can really begin to see what are those phenomena that are happening. Now, if you're starting at the beginning, and I think this is an important approach for creative placemaking projects in particular, because developmental evaluation works with processes where innovation is at its core. And it really came out of the world of social innovation and social change, and where it was recognized that in many projects, development evaluation starts at the beginning and you have no idea where you're going. So it's very hard to say, well, we're going to measure something when we really can't define what it is that we know exactly what's happening. So we need to be able to move much more quickly, much more iteratively, test ideas within the project, and surface new issues and react to them. So techniques for this are going to be much different. You yourself might be doing observations, noticing not only what you see, but what you don't see happening. Very good thing to do if you are the project manager and doing evaluation, this happens often, is to develop the habit of not only going to meetings and helping them happen, but taking those 10 minutes right after to write notes about your observations and getting into the habit of noting those. You may be doing one-on-one conversations that happen at a regular level. Maybe they happen every month. You get together and you just say, how are we doing? And what are we doing? You may pull together group stories and narratives like appreciative inquiry that can help you identify emergent ideas, emergent impacts. Or you might be doing right now surveys that ask 3 quick questions at the end of an event or a meeting. Questions such as, what am I most concerned with? What do I need most help with? What is the largest success that we could achieve? So if those are 3 ways of thinking about evaluation, structuring them, and again, they're all time-bound. They're all strategically introduced at different times and introduce different techniques. They're summative, formative, and developmental. I also want to introduce briefly the idea of bringing in the community, because that's so important to creative placemaking, and it's very easy to do within evaluation. I think very often in evaluation we think that we are evaluating what's happening to the community, but the community can very much be there with us. They can be there with us as we ask questions. They can be there with us as we're sorting data. They can be there with us as we're creating larger narratives around this. I often think of evaluation as creating very big piles of information, sorting it into littler piles, then naming what those little piles are, and then creating that story that connects those piles and tells the story of the project. And the community can come in at any time. So I wanted to just give a quick illustration. This is a picture of the teams from the Forklift DanceWorks project, which you heard about last month. I have had the pleasure and honor of working with the Forklift team as helping them with the evaluation over their 3-year project. And in this last year, the teams were there, and they worked as production assistants, they worked as performers, and they also worked as evaluators. We trained them in some basic ideas of evaluation. They went out and interviewed community members. We thought of questions. And then we also came back together, and this is what was important. They not only helped us to bring data in, but then they helped us to sort that information. And so we went through an exercise called a silent sort, where in the cards with black ink, they were creating mind maps of what it is that they were experiencing or the community was experiencing. And then we sorted those into piles and we named those. Those are the cards with red ink. And then together we all sat there around the picnic table and started talking about how do all these red cards relate to each other? What is the story of the experience of the community? What is the story of your experience as a project participant? And they had beautiful insights. It was really quite amazing. These 15, 16, 17-year-olds bringing reflection and ideas that have influenced the larger evaluation project. So a quick review. Questions to be asking at the beginning. You want to ask when, at what point are we in the project, and what do we need to understand? Again, the type of evaluation you bring in will dictate the methods. What scale are you working at? Or do you want to identify outcomes? Do you want to identify individual outcomes, or maybe it's community level or systems level? What kind of outcomes are you looking for? Again, they will probably change, but choose a direction to enter in through. Maybe you want to look at knowledge building or attitude shifting or skill building. Maybe it's more about policy changes or practice changes. Then you also want to decide when and how is it that you'll bring the community in. Again, you can decide they can come in at any time and it can always help to build and strengthen those relationships. And then finally, at the beginning, know who is it that's going to receive your story, because they are not only going to receive the story, but they're going to pass it along. So what do they need to know, and how can that influence what it is that you will be exploring? Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out a couple of tricky things. There can always be explosions in the background. Figuring out first who is doing the evaluation. This is very important. Very often they have found in creative placemaking projects it is most likely the project manager who will be doing it, which is fine. There's lots of resources out there, but just make sure that you can carve out time for it. Recognize that qualitative and quantitative information are different and equally valuable. I find they work together best. They work best together. But don't worry if you're at an early stage of the project. You may only have qualitative information, and that's okay. Keep in mind risks about confidentiality. If you tell someone that your conversation is confidential, that needs to be honored throughout the project. So keep track of that. Don't shy away from the intangible. There's beautiful moments of serendipity that happen in creative placemaking projects. Honoring that and naming it are important, I think, to the larger field. And very critically, remember to always give back. Research can very often be extractive. We're taking information from the community about the community, but ideally it's about relationship building, and you are giving to the community. So if you find yourself in a circumstance where you are doing an interview and taking information from someone, make sure that there's always some way to give back and to have that be part of the larger evaluation approach. And then, of course, just keep it real. It is complex. Don't worry, you cannot evaluate everything, but decide one door to enter in and then allow yourself to identify the other changes that are associated with that first direction you're going. And then there are some excellent resources that are out there, so you are not alone. And I've put up just a few here, and just entering into any one of these doors will take you in the direction of many other resources that are available. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Aileen, who will tell us the story about Opalaka.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that very thorough and helpful overview. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I am excited to share some insights with you about what evaluation and impact look like from the creative placemaking practitioner's perspective, using some examples from my time at the Opalaka Community Development Corporation. The CDC was established in 1980 to address the economic and housing issues of the community. So I'm just going to give a kind of quick background overview of our early stages of creative placemaking, as well as going into more detail using 3 case studies that highlight the physical, economic, and social impact of some of our projects and some of our findings from that whole process. As a contextual reference, for those who don't know, Opa-locka is located in South Florida. It's about halfway between downtown Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Our population is about 65% Black and 35% Hispanic, with about 40% of the population living at or below the poverty line. Unfortunately, the city has a lingering reputation that stems from the drug trafficking and crime that occurred in the city in the 1980s and early 90s. And even though the city has cleaned up a lot since then, whenever you say Opa-locka in the South Florida area, people kind of cringe and go, oh, why would you work there? What's going on there? It's dangerous. You know, there's a lot of drugs, all of these negative connotations, even though the community has become a lot better today. And so it's also important to note that Opa-locka has the largest collection of Moorish revival architecture in the Western Hemisphere. Think kind of Aladdin-inspired Alibaba and the Seven Thieves, as you can see from the picture of the former City Hall on the slide. And so this inclusion of a unique architectural and design-based identity in the city's creation, it was created in 1925, was part of why OLCDC wanted to include the arts and culture as part of its community development work. And so we had actually received a catalytic NEA Our Town grant in 2011, and for that we partnered with the Miami-Dade County Department of Cultural Affairs and launched a call to artists for ideas of how to transform barricaded streets within a neighborhood, as well as empty lots, into vibrant public spaces as part of a strategic neighborhood revitalization process. We had over 200 artists apply, and 5 artists or artist teams were chosen to help move the process forward. So we had Roberto Bejar and Rosario Marquardt of R&R Studios, Walter Hood of Hood Design, Gail Fulton Ross, who's an independent artist based in Florida, Jennifer Bonner and Christian Stainer, and we also had the help of Rick Lowe from Project Row Houses. And so together we worked with community stakeholders, elected officials, businesses, residents, students, other nonprofit partners, as well as for-profit partners to do artist-led community evaluation. This was, I guess, going back to Lynn's slides, kind of the developmental evaluation process. Before we actually jumped into the creative placemaking work, we wanted to kind of take a step back and from an artist-driven lens that definitely included the community to do kind of a self-evaluation of Opa-locka to really see what our challenges and opportunities were. And so we did this through a series of design charrettes and community meetings, student outreach to certain schools in the community. We had about 3 charrettes, I believe, that just brought all of these stakeholders together to see how the arts can enhance and transform on a neighborhood level, but then also scale it to a citywide level. Another evaluation process that we used, which came through Walter Hood, was a walk shop. It's a walking workshop, excuse me. So the walk shop was Walter's idea. He was really interested in how people viewed the streets and the public realm around the streets, the sidewalks, and all of that. And so we got, on 2 different Saturdays, we had 2 different walk shops, had about 20 to 30 residents in each one, different ages, different abilities, different parts of the community. We came to this one neighborhood that we were working in called the Triangle, and literally walked the street from one end to the other, and it was a really interesting process in which, you know, we were able to observe through both one-on-one conversations, group conversations, and some questions that were led by Walter, what the insight of the community was into the history of the neighborhood, what their values were, and what some of the current challenges were, and what they were hoping artists, along with the CDC and the city and our other partners, could address together. So it was a really enlightening process. I would definitely recommend to anyone who's looking for a kind of a non-traditional way of evaluating what's around to actually go out of a room and to the streets or the community where you are, and to hold the evaluation process outside, where you can actually see and point out, this house was owned by this family, and then the lot next to it has been abandoned for 15 years, but it used to be a playground for kids, and that's something we want to come back. These were comments that we heard from the residents going through the workshop, and all of these ideas got translated into the Opa-locka Public Art Master Plan, which we published in 2012, taking the ideas from the artists and the community into how different ways the arts could be implemented into community development. And so we were looking at the streets, we were looking at vacant lots, we were looking at abandoned houses and other buildings, and how those could be transformed into more community or intentional, purposeful spaces, as well as how do you create public space, but also more traditional public art that's representative of the community. It outlined a lot of different strategies that we could do and implement, both in a 1, 5, 10, 20-year kind of timeline. And it was a great way to visualize, by implementing the arts, how can we measure our progress as a community in establishing this change that we are hoping to create. And it's also important to note that the Public Art Master Plan was done kind of in tandem with 2 other strategic community planning documents, Vision 2020, which was a more holistic neighborhood revitalization plan, and Sustainable Opa-locka 2030, which was looking a little bit more into the future, but more geared towards the downtown neighborhood rather than residential neighborhoods. And so all of these together provided kind of an overarching framework and guide that we could use to measure our progress over the year. And like I said, the plan had several different ideas and potential projects that we could move forward. And we found out in a couple months of sharing this master plan and trying to pitch to funders or potential funders to help move some of these projects forward into the implementation stage, that it was a lot to bite off all at once. We needed to kind of take a step back and pick one part of the puzzle to put together first. And so in kind of evaluating all of the different parts that we had put together in the plan and talking to community members, as well as city officials and potential funders and what they were interested in, part of our ability to gauge success was really the ability to fundraise for project implementation, as well as to get the community buy-in. We realized that they were excited to have these conversations, but they were also a bit skeptical. There were a few other groups before us that had come in, not with the arts, but with other kind of transformative projects, with housing and parks and whatnot, that they had promised the community and had not delivered on in 2, 3, 5 years. And so because of all of these empty promises, the community was understandably hesitant to really move forward in the process, because they wanted to see something pretty immediate, to say, you know what, we are serious about the change that's happening. It's not just for show or for talk. And so that's why we were looking at trying to implement a project that would have a pretty quick physical impact, knowing that seeing is believing, and that community members, even funders and other partners wanted to see something different happening in Opelika. And so with that, we were able to secure funding for one of Walter Hood's early projects that was focused on the streetscape along Alibaba Avenue. Alibaba is one of the main thoroughfares that connects the east and west sides of the cities, but it's a very long and barren road. As you can see in some of this, there aren't wide sidewalks, and then part of the project was also realizing that there were a lot of kind of like benches and poles and utility boxes and different signs that were placed along the sidewalk, but in inconvenient spots so that it made it really difficult for people to actually walk on the sidewalks. So there are often times where you would see people walking in the streets or on the bike lanes. And we have one gentleman that we saw who was rolling his wheelchair along the side instead of being able to use the sidewalk. So this painting project was a way to really bring the community together to highlight through the use of paint these objects that were interfering with our ability to use the public realm in a way that was really beneficial for the residents there. And to call attention to the streets of Opelika, knowing that there's not a lot of landscaping, and that the city at the time was securing funding to do a major street renovation. And so how can we begin dialogue about what we want our streets to look like? So this was we painted about a quarter of a mile of the thoroughfare in downtown Opelika. It started at the train station and went all the way down to a local elementary school, and engaged over 300 community members and volunteers in both the project design and implementation of the project. So there was a lot of buy-in. I remember the day that we went out there and painted, it was a Saturday in April, and we were out there at about 5 o'clock in the morning. And this gentleman showed up at around 5:30, and he was a local resident, and he was just so excited to be there. And he said, "This is what I've wanted to see happen in my community. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be part of the change. Like, how can I help?" So we definitely put him and all of the other volunteers to work. And it was a really beautiful day of bringing people together and, again, showing a physical change in the community that could happen when we all collaborate. That's something that I should touch upon because it's on the slide, but part of what made this project easy to happen, as well as some other of our physical impact projects, was having our artist in residence, our designer in residence, Jermaine Barnes, being appointed to the city's planning and zoning board. So having him through both the artistic lens and an advocate for our projects really facilitated the feasibility of us implementing this project, as well as other things that we had carried out. And so it was an interesting lesson, both for, I believe, Jermaine, as well as members of the city and of the zoning board, to have someone who's not an elected official or someone who had been there for 20 years. Instead, Jermaine is a young Black architect from from Chicago via LA, and he came to live and work in Opelika for a lot of these creative placemaking projects. So we brought him on as our designer in residence, and we realized that we needed a stronger advocate within the city, and so they were open to having him on as the artist in residence, and it helped to really, I think, translate some of the communications that were happening, and he was really good at finding ways to bridge that communication gap between all the different stakeholders. And then next, following kind of the physical impact, people were definitely inquiring about what the economic impact of creative placemaking was on the community, and why we were investing all of this money and resources into a certain place, knowing that if you invest into the people as well as the place and help to create future opportunities, that it will really stimulate the economic growth of the community. And so the project I'm going to talk about here is the Thrive Urban Farm. And so this was an abandoned lot just on the side of where the street painting happened. And we were able to purchase it and turned over 4,000 square feet into a working urban farm in a little under a year. We're able to hire 2 local gentlemen to manage the farm, as well as train both students and other young people in the community of how to do urban farming in their community. And so through internships and different job development programs, working with the South Florida workforce, we are able to stimulate some job creations around this project, which was actually an artist-driven project as well. We had several artists identify the need for food, being that Opa-locka is a food desert, as something that we should take on. And so we had over 25 volunteer days, 300 volunteers to help plant and harvest 35 types of produce. And despite Hurricane Irma happening in the middle of our build out for the farm and our first planting season, we are still able to sell over 300 pounds of produce, as well as support 6 local businesses, caterers, juicers, some small local mom and pop restaurants. And then the business plan definitely stimulates that there will be additional growth over the years, and there's plans to expand the farm into other vacant lots so that we're able to support more residents and more businesses. There's definitely a need that we've realized to track the numbers of the impact of the farm and how it could potentially, help stimulate growth in the area. So far, there's 1 new business that's firmly established, but it will definitely be an interesting study to look at about how as the farm grows in the next couple of years, how, I see your note, Rebecca, thank you, as how the farm grows in the next couple of years, how other businesses could be stimulated in the area. And then lastly, looking at the social impact of creative placemaking, one thing that I like to say is just remember who you're doing the projects for, but also who you're doing it with, because you should be working with a lot of people, like I said, various stakeholders in implementing these projects. And so going into with this mindset, especially with evaluation, knowing that ultimately the people who are involved in the projects are who are going to be impacted the most. So I'm going to quickly go through our Art of Transformation Street Festival, where this was one of our early projects that stemmed from the Public Art Master Plan and bringing festivals and activity back to the downtown area. There was a history of it happening before, but it stopped in about the 1990s. So we're bringing back this culture of festivals and knowing how that these kind of cultural gatherings stimulate and convene community, how they increase engagement, as well as collaboration. This festival was done about 6 months before the street painting, and so that definitely helped people want to participate in the street painting project because they saw that there was a movement to enliven the downtown area and help redefine the downtown neighborhood. And the festival is also really important in helping to change mindsets. I mentioned earlier about how there was a negative stereotype about Opa-locka, and so having cultural activities that made it safe and fun for people to come out and experience the city definitely helps with our moving towards our goals of making Opa-locka a place where people want to live, work, play, and create. And so with that, I'm going to throw it back to Lynn to do some reflections, and I think we're going to take some Q&A.
Thanks, Aileen. I love the work that you all are doing down there in Opa-locka. And so I wanted to just give some quick reflections on the projects that you were describing from an evaluation lens, and some of the really beautiful things that were happening in the projects that I think are, that folks can broadly relate to, is that there was a lot of community engagement that was happening with the artists that they were doing, and it was the artists who were helping the community to identify the values, their assets, their challenges. As a larger organization, you all were looking at these projects and to try and understand them in a temporal scale. What were the changes that you could see happening over time, and how could you notice those along the way and capture those as you did? The other thing that I think, if we're looking at scales of outcomes, what you were describing was really happening at a community level. What you talked about was these changes that were happening in terms of discourse, in terms of actions, practices, and civic engagement. And so if there was a next step that the Opa-locka CDC could take, it would be to start developing a larger theory of change, of how all these impacts started to come together, and you could see the ways that these outcomes were happening with and through art, that art was changing the ways that people were thinking about spaces and programs, that art was changing the way that the community was taking ownership of their spaces, how they function, how these spaces tell stories, and that art was changing the nature of personal and civic relationships within the community, and bringing those all together into a larger narrative that tells the beautiful story of how art was impacting this complex and diverse community. So thank you. And with that, I will pass it back to Rebecca, who will lead us through some questions.
Great, thank you, Lynn. We have gotten a few questions on the line. I'm just going to run through them quickly. So the first one I think is directed towards Lynn, but Eileen, feel free to jump in on this one as well if you have ideas. So the question is, what is the best way to track intangible or qualitative data so that you can meaningfully access it later on?
So I think there's two parts to that question. One of it is about those intangibles, and then some very pragmatic things of like, how do you track information during the project? I think we're sometimes hesitant to name those more ephemeral parts of the arts-based work, but I think it is very important that we name it and claim it. They may function outside of traditional community development language and perspectives, but they are a fundamental aspect of what arts bring to our work. And so again, naming it is important. Some basic things in terms of how to capture information, like I said, getting into the habit of taking notes at the end of the meeting. I use on my iPhone, I use my little notes app, and I just type the name of the project and write down, type my quick observations, and then collect those and use those later for writing out larger notes. I love the technique that Marty Pottinger uses. When she receives an email with information or feedback from someone, she will email it back to herself with changing the subject to say feedback or data, community data, so that she can then quickly do a search through her email to capture all that information. So I hope that gets a bit at your question.
Awesome. Okay, this next one is for Eileen. How were the artists who led the community evaluation that you had mentioned early on in your slides, how were those artists chosen or selected?
Those artists were chosen through a community selection process, as that I said that we had partnered with the Miami-Dade County Department of Cultural Affairs. So for each public art call, they have a community panel that's made up of experts as well as local residents and stakeholders. And so we had different criteria that we were looking for each artist. Some of it had to do with kind of name recognition and knowing that sometimes funders want to, give money to projects with like more established artist names. But then we also were really looking to highlight more minority artists, Black or Brown artists who are representative of the community. We wanted to make sure that even though we were also choosing some more established names, that we were also working with local artists as well and balancing that. And then the last thing was just kind of the overall ideas and making sure that, they all had different qualities and expertise levels that they brought to the table, looking at different things from public spaces to the streets to traditional public art to even food. We wanted to have a well-rounded team of artists. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. And we've gotten this question in a couple different forms, so hopefully I ask it in a way that will answer what people are thinking about. But I think this question is for Lynn. Lynn, or Eileen for that matter, could you give an example of a time when an organization or a project brought information back to a community that was, part of this evaluation or assessment process that in your, experience worked well?
I think often I think this happens in just the nature of the artist work itself, and so I think this talks about sort of the many different layers of that information has. So an artist will I know in one of Aileen's projects, one of the artists sat there literally on the street in the community in a chair just talking with people for days. And gathering stories and information. Now, for her as an artist, the representation of that data was as an artistic project, was in terms of sketches and ideas and ultimately something that would be created within the community. If you're looking at that same information, and that's a great way to bring the information back. If you're looking as a project manager, another way to bring that same information back that you're gathering from those community conversations is just as they did in the form of a master plan. So that's a project-based way of doing it. Another way to do it is if they had a formal evaluation process and they would bring it back as a theory of change and say to the community, is this the way you see arts working, and is this helping to tell the story of what it is that you are all experiencing? I think traditionally evaluation has been thought of as extractive. We take information from and about. And so now, and particularly within creative placemaking, changing that perspective and looking at it as very relational. So I think just recognizing that can happen in many different ways by many different parts of the project, and all of them are valid.
Awesome. Thank you guys both so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for questions at this point. Again, thank you, Lynn and Eileen, for sharing just a wealth of information on today's webinar. We did record the webinar today, and we'll be posting on the LISC Creative Placemaking site, the same site where you registered, and that lists all the webinars that have happened and are coming up. The next webinar is happening next month, February 13th, and it's all about documenting the process and communicating success with a creative placemaking project. So with that, I thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, thank you, Lynn and Eileen, and all of our partners, and we will see you next month. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.